We are now ready for our second thought vignette of the day. And I know Susan and I are really excited to hear Keith's presentation. Keith Hampton is the assistant professor in the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. And he is going to lead us through our next thought vignette entitled Community and Social Interaction in the Wireless City. Please welcome Keith Hampton.
Stage, go to advance the slide.
Great, thank you very much. Where's my clicker here?
Thanks for not wearing the jacket.
Okay, so continuing on from where we left off on the last panel, the work I'm going to present today is very much about thinking of how new information and communication technologies are changing our habitat in the built environment. So I'm going to try and go through three questions. I'm going to throw a lot of data and a lot of information at you very quickly here. The first is, do new communication information technologies reduce our use of traditional social settings, such as public spaces and semi-public spaces? Does it reduce our interactions with those who are around us, including our existing acquaintances, our neighbors, and strangers that we encounter in the built environment? And does it make communication possible where it was not possible before? So before I do that, I'm just going to help frame where we are in terms of just how pervasive these new technologies are in the built environment. So this is from a survey that I did with Pew about 2 years ago. So these numbers are underinflated to where we are today. Just to give you a sense of just how pervasive this technology use is, 36% of people who are in a public library are using the internet while they're there. 18% of those people who are in cafes or coffee shops, all the way down to 8% of people who are visiting public parks, and even 5% of people who are in church are using the internet while they're there in those spaces. And, you know, just to characterize, I mean, this isn't just a personal habit. We're doing a lot as architects and as builders of these spaces to encourage people to use these technology in space. This doesn't show up too well, but this is a picture from Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia, and it's outside a church, and it says, "Get connected here. Free worship, free Wi-Fi." So how does the use of new technologies affect the use of spaces like public spaces? Well, much of this debate, we get caught in a kind of idealized notion of just how important the built environment is and just how important public spaces are without really thinking about the outcomes behind those assumptions. So the use of public spaces is associated with many positive outcomes. One positive outcome that we know a lot about is the diversity of people's social networks. So we know that people who participate in diverse social milieus like public spaces, semi-public spaces, cafes, restaurants, the more they participate in those types of spaces, the more diverse their social networks become. Diverse social networks are associated with all sorts of good things for us. They make us physically healthier, they make us mentally healthier, it's associated with trust, it's associated with tolerance, and it's associated with access to more and better information that cuts across social, behavior, and ideological boundaries. The question we have to address is whether the introduction of new technologies into these built environments, these existing traditional social milieus, whether it somehow results in either less visits to those spaces or less meaningful interaction while we're in the built environment. So this is a lot of numbers that are probably more than you need, but what this does is this gives us a way of kind of standardizing and interpreting the impact of the built environment on the diversity of our social networks. So this looks at things like interactions in semi-public spaces, religious institutions, voluntary groups, truly public spaces like parks and markets, and neighborhood ties, and their relative contribution to our social networks and to the diversity that we encounter in our everyday lives. And this gives you an example of how we compare these things. So about 10 visits to a semi-public space in a given month, like cafes and restaurants, is equivalent to about a quarter of a standard deviation in your average network diversity over time. It's almost about the same as having four church visits in a month, almost the same as 2 voluntary groups. It's not quite as good as visiting a truly public space like a public park, and nowhere near as good as knowing, say, all your neighbors. So if you did all these things that are up here on the display, you'd be doing better than about 90% of the population in terms of having a diverse social network. So the question becomes, what happens when we introduce new technologies to this? What happens when we start thinking about internet use, blogging, using of social network sites like Facebook, instant messaging, cell phone use? Do these types of interactions work the same way the built environment does? Do they contribute to network diversity in a similar way? So what we find is, yes, they do, but just in a very limited way. In and of and by themselves, things like internet use are equivalent to about 7 cups of coffee a month, or 7 visits to Starbucks or other kind of semi-public space. Heavy internet use is equivalent to about 2 visits to church a month, minus salvation. And social networking sites have a contribution to the diversity of your network equivalent to about 3 visits to a public park. But where this becomes really interesting is when we look at all these relationships together. Now, this is more than you can manage to look at in one moment in time, but what this tells us is there's some really interesting interactions going on between our use of new technologies and our use of space. So what that chart tells us is about half of the social benefit of using a lot of new technologies, including social media and so on, comes from its relationship to place. So we get about half of the social benefit of using those technologies as a result of how those technologies interact with place. So for example, internet users visit semi-public spaces more frequently. Bloggers go to church more. They're also more likely to be in public spaces. People who share digital photos online are more likely to visit public spaces. And people who use cell phone are more likely to volunteer, go to church, and hang out in cafes. But what do people do when they're inside these public spaces? Well, a couple of years ago, we set out to replicate some of the work of a very well-known urbanist, William White. And we visited some of the same public space that he had visited in the 1970s and early 80s, and we tried to replicate his work by spending a lot of time just watching people in these public spaces. So we hung out a few hundred hours in public spaces in New York City, in Toronto, in Philadelphia, and in San Francisco, and we interviewed people there, and we observed about 1,000 people using different types of media, whether it was books or cell phones or using the internet or reading a magazine. So this is the type of stuff we do. This is us on the far end here watching the laptop user. And here's our question, right? So which one of these is better or worse for a public space in terms of the types of outcomes we're interested in, like the diversity of your social network? Is it the young lady on her cell phone? Is it the young lady on her laptop? Is it the guy in the middle there, the portable gaming device? Is it the guys with their shirts off in the background? Which one of these has a more strong impact on this urban setting in terms of positive social outcomes? So here's what we found. We found that people who are using the internet in public spaces 2 years ago when we did this study, actually almost 3 years ago now, 25% of the people we had interviewed had never been to that public space before they could start accessing the internet there. 70% of those who had previously visited those spaces in the past said that they now visited more often because the technology was present. And these people aren't just light users. So the average laptop user in a public space that we encountered spent 2 hours a week there, with a lot of variation in terms of what type of space they were attracted to and how popular different spaces were. They almost always came alone. Anybody using the internet in public space, about 78% of the time they were there by themselves. While they had very few kind of co-located acquaintances, they had very, very high co-presence. Meaning they were interacting with a lot of people online while they were in those public spaces, so they weren't truly alone. The types of people they were interacting with weren't the types of people that we see people interacting with when they're on the cell phone, for example. Cell phone interactions tend to be very intimate. It's a very small number of people, a very close network. The type of people we were observing people interacting with using wireless internet technology in these spaces was much more diverse. In fact, the diversity of the interactions they had online were almost equivalent to the diversity of types of interactions we'd expect them to have in public spaces in general if they weren't by themselves. What type of activities were they doing in their space? What was most interesting is that their use of this technology inside the public spaces was mostly directed at engaging in the public sphere. When they weren't interacting with these diverse social ties, they were doing things like interacting on social networking websites like Facebook. They were blogging. Almost 50% of them were consuming some sort of online news or political information. And about 10% of them were observed doing something that we call serendipity, so actually encountering a real stranger in these public spaces and having some sort of meaningful interaction. And then an additional 12% had some kind of less meaningful interaction, like, can I borrow this chair, or how's your internet access over here? And 28% of those people who reported serendipity in these public spaces reported that those relationships lasted over time. 1 in 6 reported that they maintained contact over time, but only 4 of the entire people that we encountered associated that serendipity with the use of the technology. How did this compare to other types of media use in public spaces? Well, we found that people who were using the internet in public spaces were very similar to people who were reading books in public spaces. and very unlike people who are, say, using a mobile phone, who tended to be very distracted, almost had no serendipity, and completely different than people who are wearing earbuds and listening to music, who we never observed having any kind of serendipity ever, not even once. We were also very interested in whether there was some kind of contextual effect going on as a result of the technology. So this is the idea that there's something about the use of wireless internet inside an environment that might dissuade others who are inhabiting that space with you from being involved in some kind of social interaction. So in neighborhoods, for example, if you're a social butterfly and you move into a neighborhood where nobody is interested in neighboring, don't matter how social you are, you're never going to make a friend because the context just doesn't support it. So the question is there anything about urban public spaces that changes as a result of the technology? So we were interested in finding environments that look a lot like this. So you can see the guy, he's got the little tuff, he's clearly the central element of Bryant Park on this particular day, completely surrounded by laptop users. So the question becomes, as you enter a public space where there's use of this technology, is there ever a context where you become less socially involved simply because you're surrounded by people who are less likely to be interested in socializing because of their use of technology? And what we found was that this only ever really occurred in Bryant Park and on very rare occasions, and it had nothing to do with the technology, it had everything to do with the context of that particular social setting. Manhattan, lunchtime, don't figure a lot of people are there to work, more so than almost any other public space that we observed, and anywhere there were people who were interested in working, they were far less interested in socializing in general. But there were also things about the design of those spaces that were changing as a result of the introduction of the new wireless infrastructure. And that was that things like those these movable tables that William White was so interested in putting into this public space have really changed now that people have wireless internet use there. Once these were a tool for social interaction and a way for people to organize in a space for serendipity, now they become a tool for people to isolate themselves with laptops in different social settings, and it actually pushes away opportunities for interaction. We observed a lot more sociability where there was actually fixed seating in public spaces. So what did we learn about mobile computing and public spaces through these studies was that people who are using these technologies in these spaces are less approachable, they're less attentive than other people using the urban environment in those spaces. Nonetheless, they do experience serendipity at a rate that's similar to other people using more traditional media in those spaces. There's some supporting evidence, although we're not really suggesting causation here, that if you build an environment like this and you introduce the technology, it does increase use of those spaces. We found new opportunities for engagement in the public sphere as a result of this technology. So, for example, very specific segments of the population, young people in particular, were much more likely to be drawn to these spaces than they were in the past. And the types of activities that they were doing online while in these spaces were, in fact, very similar to the types of engagement that we hope to see in public spaces in general, even though they were alone and even they were doing it online. The last question I have is, does it make communication possible where it was not before? So there are a series of studies that I've been involved in that have looked at interaction at the neighborhood level as a result of new technologies. And these are studies where we don't build community technology centers, we don't go out and give people access to that technology, but we go into specific neighborhood settings and we give them something as simple as a neighborhood email list, and then we walk away and we see if they adopt that technology and they use it to build local social ties over time. And what we found was through a series of studies in Canada in the late 1990s and then outside Boston in the middle of the last century, that when you give neighborhoods this technology, it actually does lead to a greater number of local social ties over time. But it tends to only support interaction in communities that are already well positioned to benefit in terms of social capital. So those neighborhoods that are already likely to form a lot of local ties are most likely to grab onto this technology and build even more local social ties. Not exactly an example of how it builds communication where it wasn't possible before. So in the last few years, starting in 2004 and leading right up to today, we started a study that specifically tests whether or not if you introduce these technologies into areas that have incredible concentration of disadvantage, meaning neighborhoods in our country that are in the 20th percentile for the most highest levels of poverty, highest levels of unemployment, highest levels of racial segregation, if they're introduced to the same technology, will they use it the same way as neighborhoods that are incredibly advantaged? These are neighborhoods that are already disadvantaged in terms of lower access to the technology and existing in a social context that's less likely to be conducive to local tie formation. So can we undermine this context of disadvantage? So we introduced a website in 2004 called iNeighbors.org. This is almost a view of the current incarnation of the site. And it's built around a very simple model that if we build a technology that allows people to simply communicate online through a neighborhood discussion list and post things like photos and so on and create photos, will they use it? Will it lead to more social interaction at the local level? So when we launched this in 2004, in the first month, we had about 5,000 participants. We have about 100,000 participants today using this in literally thousands of neighborhoods across the country. We've delivered about 10 million messages between neighbors in the last 12 months or so. And what we did was we did an analysis of our 50 most active neighborhoods. We divided those neighborhoods into a continuum of disadvantage. So we used census data to determine just how much disadvantage were in those neighborhoods that were most active in our sites. What was their level of poverty? What was their level of unemployment? What was the level of racial segregation? Then we took the content of the messages that they were exchanging online, and we analyzed the content of those messages to see if there were comparable levels of social cohesion and interaction and discussion about local problems in areas of concentrated disadvantage compared to those who were in wealthy suburban neighborhoods. And what we found was stuff like this. So this is a quote from a neighborhood email list that's in a neighborhood that's in the 7th percentile for the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in the country. I'll just read it out loud here. It says, "Before, people could call me with information that I knew needed to be spread around, but I did not have the tools to do it, and it was frustrating. We had a powerful way to communicate with each other whenever we needed to. We've caught criminals and forced the local government to give us more police protection, given out tips for securing our homes, removed a postal carrier from our neighborhood who drank on the job and misdelivered mail for years." You'd be surprised at how often that theme actually pops up. Created lasting friendships, cleaned up our streets, recommended neighbors who are skilled craftspeople to each other, found homes for stray animals, fixed water leaks, kept each other informed of important neighborhood news, recommended neighborhood restaurants, and yes, even vented some frustration. 7 weeks ago, I had a bicycling accident and broke my femur. Through the neighborhood email list, the community found out about my situation, and people made an outpouring of support, which has been vital to my recovery and helpful to my wife and me in many practical ways. The type of neighborhood, local, collective advocacy that we would not expect to see in a neighborhood of concentrated disadvantage. So what we found is that when we introduced this technology just out there as a website, and we looked at who adopted it, that a disproportionate number of communities adopted it from areas that were high in concentrated disadvantage. So of the most active neighborhoods on our website, 28% of them are from the bottom 20th percentile for most disadvantaged neighborhoods in America, which is considerably higher than what we'd expect both at random and what we know about how the existing context does not support local social tie formation. An analysis of the content of those messages revealed that, in fact, when local communities adopt these technologies, whether they're advantaged or disadvantaged, they use it in very similar ways for local social cohesion and collective action. So, in fact, internet technologies may matter more for place and matter more for some populations in place than in the past. So, in conclusion, how are new communication technologies changing social interactions in the built environment? The more diverse and extensive the use of new technologies, the more diverse and extensive the use of traditional public spaces. Use of many technologies is associated with high levels of participation in those space, which then in turn leads to higher levels of network diversity. ICTs make communication possible where it was once difficult in the past, and examples include possibly changing the context of concentrated disadvantage in terms of who adopts these technologies for what ends in predictable ways, and new opportunities for discursive political participation in public settings that may not have been possible for some populations in the past. Moving forward, this debate is so often framed around, can we bring the built environment to its kind of classic past and revise the ideas that we felt were so important about public spaces, when in reality the public space really isn't in decline and the built environment is as strong as it ever was. The question should really be about how we can layer these new affordances that technology provides onto our existing built environment. Thank you. Did you want me to take questions? And apparently I can take questions.
Could you speculate on what it is in the human psyche that brings people to be talking to somebody else who's 1,000 miles away but want to be close to somebody else spatially? It's just a kind of cognitive dissonance as to what causes that.
Well, you know, it's a great question. We've studied people in coffee shops, for example, and the question we keep asking is, you know, why are you in these coffee shops using your computer? Why aren't you just at home? And the answer is, well, we'd like to come to these spaces to get away from home. There's so many distractions there. There's television, there's family. I can come here and be truly distracted and be really, really productive. And the answer we get over and over is that people like to be in public spaces for the same reason they always have. And it's because there's a spectacle there, because it's distracting, because it's new, because it's entertaining, because there's something about those public spaces that makes you think.
I'll suggest the possibility that being in the public space but attached to your computer may be comforting in a way. At any rate, food for exploration. Next year, I'd like to hear more. Thanks.
You're welcome. And I mean, in fact, this has always been true of public spaces. I mean, it's never been acceptable in American society to just hang out in a public space. You need some reason for being there, right? You have to be reading a newspaper. You have to be reading a magazine. You can't be alone there for no reason. And I think this is certainly, you know, gives people yet another reason to go out in public spaces that's considered legitimate. Yeah.
Hi. Jane Dender, Columbia, Maryland. I have seen at public meetings that the demographic seems to be getting older of citizens coming out to meetings, and the younger people are at home on their technology or in cafes on their smartphones. And I'm just wondering if there's a way to get both populations together when we're having civic conversations.
Right. So, I mean, I don't think that trend is particularly new. I mean, we've always known that the older tend to be more politically engaged, and the younger just aren't there yet. And it's often misconstrued as young people are becoming lazy and disengaged, when in fact young people have always been lazy and disengaged. And it's not until they get to that certain stage in their lives when these things matter to them that they become engaged. So getting them engaged prematurely has never been easy. But certainly the evidence that we see is that when young people are attracted to public spaces because of the technology that's there, attracted in ways that they may never have been in the past, that it may provide a safer, less contested way of them engaging with that kind of discourse than they have in the past. So I think it opens up new opportunities rather than shutting down existing ones. Yeah.
Mitchell
Yes.
Silver. How did you get people in church to actually say they text? Because I'm guilty. I mean, I text God. He has an Android because he has an issue with that Apple thing. But my question to you is, you make a lot of reference to public space. And if you take the public space, what happens to those cities, those towns that lack some of those public spaces? Have you done any research or know how the younger generation react when they don't have those spaces where they can go and use their social media? Because I notice a lot of your slides are referencing those semi or those public spaces.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, certainly, the trend in America is not towards generating many more public spaces, unfortunately. So one of the trends that we certainly did notice was that that segment of the population that was attracted to using public spaces because of the technology that was there were a little bit younger than we would expect to be using public spaces. So there may be something about that technology there that's attracting those people. It may also be that, there are those who argue that because of the suburbanization of America, that segment of the population, young, so on, have become somewhat disenfranchised from urban public spaces, maybe even fearful of urban public spaces, and are used to a certain sanitized environment that can't easily be replicated in a true urban public park. But by having this technology there, it may actually make them feel safer. It may provide them with an excuse for being in those public spaces and a way of engaging while they're in those public spaces, though not necessarily with the space itself, that has as much value or maybe even more value given the population than we would have been able to achieve otherwise. Yes?
Hi, Phil Downey. Wondering if you documented how the use of public space changed once Wi-Fi was introduced. Did you do any before or after analytics?
Right, so we weren't able to do a before-after because it required far too much foresight. But we were able to do it, just by monitoring people in those spaces. So the study I showed you was 7 different public spaces where we spent a total of 150 hours there, and we interviewed a few hundred people and observed about 1,500 people over time. So it provided a comparison based on people who are using the technology, people who are reading books, people who are using different technologies like cell phones and so on. So not pre and post, but certainly a comparison across those trends. And really the finding was that those people who are using the technology do tend, and I mean by the technology I mean internet use, were isolating themselves in those spaces more frequently. They were hiding behind columns and behind hot dog stands and and out of way spaces as best they could. They were less likely to be interacting with strangers in comparison to many other media, and they were also less likely to be distracted by noises in a park, say a child running around or something like that. But despite that little bit loss of serendipity and besides that little bit of siloing, it did serve as yet another reason for other people to come to those spaces. I mean, many of those observations of serendipity were other people in a public park coming up to them saying, "You're really using the internet here? How does that work for you? Does that, what do you do with your time when you're doing this?" And it involves some really interesting conversations. So not pre and post, but certainly a comparison across technologies. Thank you. Thank you.